Życzymy Państwu przyjemnej podróży.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I'm really glad that a lot of you managed to make it. It's, of course, Sunday today, so Sundays are mostly spent on brunches and napping, but you're here, and I'm very glad to see so many people. We're going to be talking about how to protect democracy in the geopolitical era. Sounds very enigmatic. We're going to try to really dissect the conversation and, first of all, try to see what we mean by democracy and what we mean by geopolitical era. Before we go into anything, first of all, this panel will be held in English. If any of you want to grab a headset, please go ahead and do so right outside the room. Let me present the panelists. First off, we have Ms. Christal Morehouse, who's the Executive Director of Comms Hub, a nonprofit supporting CSOs with evidence-based communication. We'll find out more what Comms Hub does. Next, we have Mr. Ireneusz Bil, who is the Chief Executive Director of Amicus Europea Foundation and the CEO at EnergyGate Europe. Next to him is Mr. Arun Chaudhary, who is a filmmaker working in politics. He was the first official White House videographer under the Obama administration and also worked on Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign, his presidential campaign. And right now he's working from Berlin on counter-programming for the far right globally and working on dozens of different campaigns all around the world. And last but not least, Mr. Maciej Kisilowski, who is an associate professor of law and strategy at the Central European University and also a faculty director at the CEU Executive MBA program. My name is Marta Prochwicz-Jazowska. I am the deputy head of ECFR's Warsaw office. ECFR is the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we work on creating a comprehensive European foreign and security policy. We're a think tank based in different 8 countries. So let me try to dissect the title. The title is quite dense because we have a very broad, it's a broad topic basically, but the way that we're going to look at this right now, I'll give you a bit of a lay of the land. First of all, I'm not going to try to define democracy since its inception. We're going to be looking at democracy in the way that it was defined after World War II, where democracy prevailed in Western Europe, and with the end of communism became a worldview and a part of Western values on which we built the world order, with starting off with the United States that sort of created a unipolar world and continue or don't continue to act in such a way. And it felt in the late 1990s that we were reaching the end of history. Of course, famous quotes. And we felt that we were moving towards a world in which democracy, modernity, and our Western values, liberalism, will always prevail, and that we, as the Western world, will be able to inspire or influence the rest of the world to take on these values. Now, of course, now adding this geopolitical element into today's panel, we live in a world in which the security situation is deteriorating. We're here in Poland, so this is something that we observe on a daily basis from the Ukrainian border and also from our Belarusian border. So not only does the war in Ukraine here in our neck of the woods disrupt long-held geopolitical assumptions that we talked about just now, but there are other wars in the world. The Middle East is on fire right now, dangerously increasing escalation. The US election looms large over Europe's security architecture and has the power to influence how our region develops and how the war in Ukraine and in the Middle East develops. There is strategic competition with China that continues to intensify, and we'll be talking about China a little bit as well. And of course, there's the rise of populist parties, the far right in the United States. We'll talk about that as well. But here in Europe, we're noticing that in a growing number of countries. So we're dealing with an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape. And I haven't mentioned, of course, the elephant in the room, which is the rise of technology and social media and disinformation, which contributes to the deterioration of our security and of the concept of democracy. So the protection of democracy faces challenges that are technological and political in nature. For the sake of this session, I thought that we could look at 4 specific areas. Number 1, we'll be looking with each one of the panelists, and then I'll open the floor so that you can ask your questions, because I want to make sure that you have as much of a chance to ask the questions that you want as I do. Number 1, we'll be looking at narratives that shape the environment in which we live. Number 2, we'll be looking at democracy, the way that we understand it, I think, more easily. Sort of the go-to thing that we think of democracy, especially here in Poland, is how we're doing with that, whether there are still threats to democracy in Poland. And then we'll turn it over to the US, where there are significant challenges to democracy as well, and we'll be asking our US panelists to tell us a little bit about that. And then we'll go to an even more global approach, where we'll try to see whether the democracy that we here in Europe hold so dear is something that is attractive to the rest of the world, and whether we should at all be trying to share or influence this worldview on others. So, Christal, turning to you, we're coming to realize when it comes to narratives that there's the predictive nature of words, and especially in today's social media landscape and the press landscape, we're using words such as world order, disorder, and they're being used by very different groups. Unipolarity, like I mentioned, is this idea that the United States really holds a hegemonic power over the world, versus multipolarity, which is an idea spun by the Global South, although I really don't like that term, but for the lack of a better one, the Global South and China. And democracies versus autocracies, which is a great big debate. And President Biden, when he came here twice since the full-scale invasion, said that we live in a world of democracies versus autocracies. So there are so many words that we use to describe our reality. And Comms Hub, which also, Christal, you can tell us very briefly what exactly it is that you do and how that works. But you're looking at different types of narratives, and how do you think what can the narratives that you observe in your work tell us about the world that we live in?
Sure, thanks. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here in Łódź this morning with you, and thanks for taking your Sunday to spend time with us. The way that we talk about the world bends and shapes the world. And I think with the rise of large language models, we can see how predictive the way that we talk about things can be. And the way that we're discussing democracies today is going to shape the way our future is. And some of what Comms Hub does is it tries to understand this big data, the amount of information, the amount of tweets, posts that influential people and everyday people put out into the digital space is having an outsized impact on how our world is changing. And so what we try to understand at Comms Hub is what is it that aggregates to? So if you think of just in simple terms, a user network, if every one of us in the room here is a user and we're reacting to one another's posts, that will create an interaction between us and it will form a line. And the more you and I communicate, the thicker and stronger that line will be, and the closer that our two dots, our user dots will come together. And so we can see how information is shared and communities form. And so what we want to understand is what is that conversation around democracy and the key human rights issues that are shaping our world today. And we think one key way to defend democracy is to understand these conversations. How are we discussing the world, the future that we want to live in? And when we live in polarized societies, which many of us do, that these conversations can form bubbles. And so we can have different conversations in parallel without ever interacting with one another, each of us thinking that the reality and the conversation that we live in is the one that is shared, when indeed somebody might be thinking the exact opposite. And to take some of the terms that you've asked us to discuss, if we're talking about unipolarity or multipolarity, or if we're talking about world order or disorder, if we start with world order and disorder, it's about stability and instability. And usually, there are two kind of sources or narratives that run around world order and disorder. One is a conspiracy theory about world order, which is claims that there is an elite that is trying to form an authoritarian world government. That is one way in which world order is used. But the more near to reality version of what world order is how sovereign nations, when they interact beyond their own borders, what are the rules, what are the norms in which that interaction takes place? And if you look back historically, the term world order, you might think of political leaders like Wilson after World War I, or Churchill after World War II, or George Bush the Senior after the fall of the Soviet Union. These words and terms were used to develop the UN and multilateral systems, and also that world order was meant as a peaceful, structured way for nations to interact with one another. I don't think it's a particularly useful term these days because it has been claimed by conspiracy theorists. So if I talk about world order, probably some people are going to have the conspiracy theories in mind and maybe thinking I'm talking about an elite forming some kind of authoritarian world government, whereas I'm talking about reform of veto rights at the United Nations, for example. So I think it's always better to speak more specifically when we talk about these international multilateral institutions that not everyone is familiar with, just to be a bit more specific rather than use these broad terms. Unilateral or multipolar world is also talking about how power between nations at the international level form. So if we think of the fall of the Soviet Union, then that was a brief moment where one might refer to a unipolar world in which the US was considered to have more influence or greater influence than other countries or nations. But today what we have is maybe you could think of it as democratization of power or a splintering of power. It's where there is a relative decline in the power of nations that used to hold more power. And there's a aligning or an alliance of nations, sometimes along economic factors. If you think of so-called BRICS nations, if you think of Brazil, China, India, so on, then those are alignments that form power structures that can influence things like trade, things like, well, really the projection of what is a norm at the international level. And I'll leave it there as not to go on too long.
No, thank you. That's, I think it's incredible to see that while we're talking about a topic as traditional as international relations with these definitions that, you know, if any of you studied IR, international relations, this is sort of where you start off with these broad terms. And now we're applying modern technology to understand it. It gives you a whole new dimension to learning about the world. And it's quite complex to think about it that way. But now moving over to Maciej, I think a topic that, don't know how many of you in the room are Polish, but this is definitely something that really keeps people at night at Poland, or at least it did for a long time, and I wonder if it still does. But just a broad reminder. So before the general election in October 2023, we had a right-wing populist national government in Poland, which was basically taking apart the rule of law and putting in place legislation and narratives, again, that were very dangerous for democracy. The current government also coined it in that sort of narrative, saying that the right wing is a threat to democracy. And since they came into power, they're restoring the rule of law. Question is how they're doing is of course a very broad one. But just to try to boil it down to one question, do you think that democracy in Poland is still in danger?
Thank you. Of course it is, but unfortunately, to your previous part of the question, which is it keeping people sleepless? I would say not so much. It keeps me sleepless. I mean, it keeps Professor Sadurski sleepless. But just an example, at this very moment, there is a special closed VIP session going on in the building with many speakers joining. And I was asked to drop by for a moment before this panel starts. And the title of it is, "Should Polish Liberals Go in Emergency Mode?" And when I got this title without any abstract, I asked the organizer, okay, so we are talking about the far-right threat. Yes, we just had a European election and the right-wing parties got 48%. We got 52, they got 48. So, okay, we narrowly won, but arguably if a parliamentary election was held today, there would be a very, very good chance of peace government with even more far-right Confederacja going back to power. And the organizers responded, of course not, we are not talking about Kaczynski, we are talking about war with Vladimir Putin. And I was like, yeah, that's symptomatic, unfortunately. So, let me put it clear here. Vladimir Putin is a vicious war criminal, imperialist murderer. But, I deal, as you kindly introduced me, I deal with strategies. That's my research area, intersection of law and strategy. And from a strategic point of view, the risk of war with between Vladimir Putin and NATO versus the risk of Poland sliding back to autocracy is not even comparable. I mean, the democracy is hanging by the thread. The chance of attack on NATO is very remote. I would go even farther. We'll be talking about the US, and I think we need to ask ourselves a question. With all my personal support and sympathy to Ukraine, if we get Donald Trump elected to the White House, we need to ask a question whether this was worth it. In other words, for the world democracy, if Donald Trump's success is at least partly the consequence of our stance courageous stance against Vladimir Putin, but maybe overextending, maybe going too far, maybe allowing too much inflation that hurt ordinary people. You know, I personally think that the tragedy of Donald Trump getting elected will be much, much worse than if Kiev fell. And that's not to say that the fall of Kiev wouldn't be a tragedy. I'm just saying that I don't think we fully realize how existential is the threat of authoritarian comeback. Because every time they come back, and Poland is an early example because the authoritarian party was in power in 2005. They were evicted from power by Donald Tusk. They learned, they improved, and in 2015 they came back. So this is the future for Americans. That's Trump too. This is people who learn from their mistakes, know that they need to be more vicious, more faster, speedier in their consolidation of autocracy. That will be Donald Trump too. And for us, we can have Kaczynski free. Imagine that. So, of course, yes, the threat is very real, and the fundamental way to address it is not to mirror Trump and say, our conservative compatriots are enemy within. That will lead us nowhere. The fundamental challenge is the opposite. The fundamental challenge is how we seduce conservative compatriots back to democracy. How can we be in a situation in which the Republican nominee for president is about to win, which is an ordinary thing in American politics, or in Poland, very conservative country, at least parts of the country, where we have, you know, PiS or the next right-wing party that succeeds PiS, or Konfederacja about to win the election, because that's the electoral cycle, and we are not afraid, we are not in terror about the state of our human rights, about basic freedoms. We are not in terror whether this is the last free and fair election, which is the real threat now if Kaczynski comes back to power, unless we do something. So, you know, my own little contribution to this discussion, but not only my own, with a large group of intellectuals from left to very, very conservative right. Sorry for product placement. Was this book, Let's Agree on Poland, which was published last year. And for those of you who are English speakers, it will be published in English by Oxford next year. And we try to answer the question of what we can do with our constitutional system in order to seduce conservatives back to democracy. Before this happens, this will be the major threat, whether we acknowledge it or we want to get distracted by geopolitics. Our main threat nowadays in most European countries, and certainly in the United States, is the imminent takeover by absolutely uncompromising authoritarian right. Thank you.
That was a very vibrant way. You have a very strong opinion on this. You're definitely the right person to be in this panel. I would want to give you a little bit of pushback on the threat of the war in Ukraine versus the threat of overhauling of democracy. But I think that it boils down to really where you sit. So I, on a sort of daily basis, I deal with security and defense. And if you're sitting there, then I think that observing the war in Ukraine and the way it's developing, one would think that it's more of a threat, and that but I don't want to go into that right now. That would be a whole conversation. But that's what it's very hard to compare these things, right? Which one is an actual threat, because one is a kinetic military threat / nuclear, and the other one is a change to our system. But again, it depends on where you sit. And it's unfortunately, there are a lot of silos. I think that's what it really proves. And very often when we, whichever topic we talk about, we tend to really be focused on, if we concentrate on Ukraine, then we tend not to view what's happening in the Middle East, right? This is something that I'm definitely learning on a daily basis, that the way that we view our world and our priorities, and here for Poland it's definitely Ukraine, we tend not to think about the threats of the war in the Middle East and how they're also interconnected. But that's a whole other topic. But going back to democracy and the threat of democracy. So the United States, like we laid out in the beginning, setting up, so post-World War II, this world order that, that we still live in, I guess, was premised on the power of the United States and its ability to have a system that would work for others and would serve as this shining example. Is that still the case?
You're looking at me, so I think this is I will answer on behalf of America.
Arun.
Yeah. I mean, I would say not. And cynically, I would say it probably never really was. You know, America controlled the sea lanes, these things. America had a big shot in the arm of democratic energy after World War II because of the economic situation. I think leaving America and observing politics in the rest of the world has led me to have a strong opinion that democracy is a hard thing to talk about, as you introduced our whole panel with. Where democracy is strongest is where social democracy is strongest. And when social democracy was strongest in the US was when we were scared of communism, you know? So I would say cynically that, you know, the United States pursued a much more active social, you know, taxation, spending model, feeling under the threat of this other, whether fairly or unfairly. I would say unfairly. It's much more geopolitics in the end than ideology. One could, I think, very rightly argue. But the dismantling of this, you know, the kind of end of history situation that we're talking about has led America to sort of abandon its social democracy almost in its entirety. And you see American democracy suffering as a result, I would say, very directly. And another pattern you see, you know, happening across the world that I think reflects back in this huge argument is that when the center left, or the sort of more democratic, let's say, the progressive democratic majority starts searching for the messaging outside of itself, that this is the recipe for electoral loss. So I think, you know, we see that you get diminishing returns, whether that's a country like Sweden or Finland, and I think that's the big worry in the US, is that even in the situation of you have no one offering social democracy, when this seems very much what Republicans, Democrats, everyone wants. I think we forget Donald Trump ran on giving everyone health care, along with a million other things he was planning on not giving.
Can you define social democracy so that...
Yeah, I mean, yes, and we could define it in a million ways, so that's very important. I would just say, you know, the idea that the delivery of public services in a fair and frank manner and democratic manner is the basis on which you can rest a vibrant, functioning, even market-driven economy. That you have to have this fundamental welfare state basis that is the fundamental kind of basis of what Europe has perfected and has sort of pushed on, pushed forward, and is now slowly retreating on, one would say, under the influence of the United States.
There's still a lot to talk about when it comes to Trump, but we'll leave that for a little bit. So if you have questions, please start thinking about them, because I'm going to ask one last question to our panelists, and then I want to make sure that anybody who wants to take part in this conversation actively has the opportunity to do this. So we've really sketched a lot of different areas. Some of them seem not to overlap, but one that is, I think, really connects everything is our democratic model that we as the collective West think is the one that should be applied to the rest of the world, right? Us trying to influence, not the United States was probably the best example in this, in its wars of wanting regime change around the world. So, and there's a problem with that in the global dimension. Like I mentioned, President Biden coined perhaps not coined, but he definitely used the term talking about the war in Ukraine. He said that we live in a world of democracies versus autocracies. So definitely a very us versus them, which you said, you mentioned Arun as well in your statement, that this is something that the United States built its model on, something that is the us versus them. Now, we, and this is going back to what Christal mentioned, we do not listen to what others outside of our bubble have to say. Now, what's happening is that we here in Europe think that this democracies versus autocracies slogan is the right one, that we live in democratic states, or almost perfectly democratic states, and that there are autocratic systems around the world, and ours is basically better. That is not what the rest of the world thinks. The rest of the world, if you talk to anybody from Southeast Asia, even Turkey, not to mention Africa, Latin America, and China, they view the world in a completely different way. They no longer believe that we live in a unipolar world. They do not want this type of democracy that we are so focused on influencing and maintaining. They view the world in a multipolar way, and therefore, probably as a consequence, also don't understand the type of war that we're dealing with here in next to neighboring Poland. Now, and Western democracies, there's no doubt, are absolutely less than ideal. So they just don't buy it. They view this as a double standard. Also in relation to the war in Gaza, that really just puts the fine point on it. Now, Ireneusz, do you think that the West should continue to spearhead democracy? Of course, we're fighting for it, right? This is what we want for our internal systems, like you mentioned, Maciej, but is this the model that we should be exporting to, given the fact that we're not ideal democracies, number one, and given the fact that the rest of the world doesn't want to see it the same way?
Yes, thank you very much, Marta, for the question, and thank you very much for the organizers for the invitation. I very much subscribe, by the way, to that what Arun was saying, and I think this will be visible also in my short presentation. Well, I'm sure that the description, autocracies versus democracies, or democracies versus autocracies, is a catchy rhetorical device, but also very dubious whether it's really describing, it's the prime organizing basis for international relations and international security nowadays. I am personally stemming from an environment and from an organization, the Marcus Europa Foundation, which is a progressive foundation, social democratic foundation. And well, we are very familiar with the issue of promoting democracy, but frankly speaking, it is even narrowing the goals that we have in foreign policy, because we have even coined the term of progressive foreign policy, which goes very much deeper and promoting not only democracy, but also promoting, for example, social justice, promoting equality, because we argue that without social justice, without equality, without a functioning economy, market institutions, democracies are not sustainable. And if we are speaking about Ukraine, I think that's a very good example. Ukraine was a democracy, but it was also very much unsustainable. It was an oligarchic economy with one of the largest, I think, social inequalities in Europe, which almost no rights of the workers, and it turned out to be not sustainable. But when we are speaking about the situation now, and of course the aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine, I would also be very hesitant to describe it that it's an attack on democracy. First of all, if we take this as a litmus test, we remember from 2022, even in the voting in the United Nations General Assembly, that there were a lot of democracies who, of course, voted against Russia, but there were also democracies who have withheld, like, for example, India. The largest democracy, they have withheld. They have not condemned Russia. On the other hand, there were a lot of autocracies, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and many others, Singapore, who have voted against Russia. Also in terms of sanctions, so a very practical way. We know that Israel has not joined the sanctions against Russia, but countries, authoritarian, like for example Singapore, well, they have very much been on the same foot as Western Europe. Second, also I think the reason, also Russians, how they describe it, the primary reason that Russia attacked Ukraine was not that it was a democracy. It wasn't an attack on democracy. It was an attack because Russia is not only an authoritarian, or even as Edwin Bendik said just a moment ago, even a totalitarian state, because it's a neo-imperial state with imperial goals, or even colonial aims. So that was the main reason, not the attack on a democracy. Third, well, it's always a discussion, yes, when we are speaking about international relations, foreign policy. How much values, how much interests? We have progressive say, well, of course, a value-based, value-driven foreign policy is an aim, but I cannot speak about any country who does a purely value-driven foreign policy. Even the Holy See, the Catholic Church, even they, we know that this is not a value-driven foreign policy, at least. So I think that we have to find equilibrium, yes? And this equilibrium between values and interests changes in time. And also countries in Europe, like Poland, also have to somehow balance on this scale between values and interests, dealing with countries like, for example, Belarus, dealing with countries like Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others. And the next point, by the way, because if we really want to build a strategy of combating Russia and trying to limit the imperialism, we have to also deal with countries which are not certainly not democratic, but they're also not totalitarian or even authoritarian, like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. I tell you, I've been a couple of times over there, spoke also with the politicians, and they're also very much afraid of Russia. They're even so afraid that they say we could be others. They don't believe that this will be NATO, Baltic states. They say that if there's a window of opportunity, any kind of internal turmoil, for example, in Kazakhstan, there's a huge Russian minority in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan could be next. So there are, to a large extent, also our potential allies in this global struggle of trying to somehow make the international order much more stable. So coming back to my conclusion, I think what we are speaking now, what we have the situation in, at the last point, yes, about the global south that you mentioned. The global south also, if they hear the American narrative about democracies, autocracies, they, of course, as you said, they are not buying it. For them, much more convincing argument, and I saw it by my own eyes in Brazil, where I was with a couple of Ukrainian colleagues, much more this neo-colonial narrative, that they are the victims and Russia is a big colonial power. They understand it very well. So if we would have somehow to approach these big democracies in the South, trying to explain them the situation, I would not go the avenue about democracies. Because they remember very well how much the biggest democracy, United States of the Western world, have meddled in the past in the situation in elections in South America. So of course there have to be dialogue, but the strategy against Russia, and in the future and China will also speak about it, it will be certainly not a strategy for democracy. So strategy against Russia is not a strategy for democracy. And I would end maybe here.
Thank you very much. Now I open the floor, and there are no wrong questions. As you can see, it's an extremely broad topic. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question right now? We have a mic in the room. Here we are, Professor.
Thank you very much. I have to leave in a moment for my own panel, but I wanted to register my slight point of disagreement with Mr. Bil, and I think it's very, very important to have a good account of the motives of Putin, of his invasion in Ukraine. And I must say that I completely disagree with your analysis that it should be understood as a case of neo-colonial or neo-imperialist power. If that were the case, then I believe Putin would turn out to be completely irrational, and I don't think he is. That is why I'm much more in favor of the analysis, which I understand you reject sort of Biden analysis of democracy versus autocracy. I do not think that Putin needs to occupy the territories or take scarce resources or industry of Ukraine, etc. What he cannot tolerate in his mind is a democratic, quasi-liberal EU gravitating state on his doorstep, state composed of society which is very similar to Russia, which has plenty of linkages to Russia. It is existential threat to Russian autocracy, and unless we understand that, I think we miss out on this fundamental connection between security and democracy. Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Well, Professor, I think there's no principal disagreement between us because, of course, I understand this argument, and I finally do not know what Putin thinks. But I share the observation. Yes, he could see it as a threat that because he has other democracies at his boundaries. Yes, and these were not previously very much democracies. Speaking about the Baltic states, but also Poland, in the south, maybe Mongolia to some extent. So yes, he would perceive a successful Ukrainian democracy a threat. But knowing what I know about also geostrategic aims of Russia, I would also not downplay, well, still the very much colonial approach and colonial goals of Putin. I don't know what as he perceives as a main threat. Probably what he perceives are his interests, and he wants simply to build a zone of influence. I would even know, maybe there would be even no invasion of Russia against Ukraine. If there would be some democracy, as it was before during Kuchma time, for example, there were elections, and so afterwards also there were elections, there were non-pro-Russian presidents and prime ministers. Yanukovych was also democratically elected. So probably if they would not be very much in favor of joining the EU, joining the Western NATO alliance, being not so very much nationalistic, but rather trying to somehow follow the narrative of Putin of the Slavic brotherhood, even if there would democracies, I think Putin would not decide to invade. But I think what the main problem was that there was a very strong, big national state with national consciousness being built in Ukraine. There was a famous book of Andrew Wilson, a British historian, who wrote about the Ukrainians, the unexpected nation. And I think Putin also has not expected that the Ukrainians will finally become a nation. And I think that was the main turning point for him in the decision to go to seek a solution by force.
As you can see, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think China provides a clear example of the sort of neo-colonial argument because places, and again, I'm outclassed by experts here. I'm, a humble ad man, making propaganda. But when you're doing such in Africa, in Latin America, it is the sort of manner in which, first it was very welcome, the bridge and tunnels and the roads and the dams, but they were made in a manner that was very familiar to people in forms of colonialism, right? Like who was being employed, only Chinese workers, what was being used, only Chinese materials, all the kind of money flowed back, and the quality was also low. And so this is the argument that works politically.
So the way we frame things and explain the origins really plays an important role. Is there any, oh, here we go.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about how to balance, amidst the geopolitical challenges that we have, wars going around. I think we can all see that there are certain countries that are seeing their sovereignty or redefining their sovereignty and are seeking to different measures when it comes to their own national security. So how can we balance the need to have this national security while also preserving, civil liberties that we seek to protect? So what frameworks or strategies can we, have to make sure that the measures that, need to be taken are not eroding the democratic values? Because I feel like this within discourse, even within the European Union, that happens to be a big problem for some countries. They don't agree with certain measures, but they need them, but they also don't know how it will work within the society, within the nation. You know, we want to be free, we want to be safe. How can you balance all that? Because I feel like that's the biggest challenge that we're facing now. Thank you.
So a question about recommendations as well. Who would like to take that?
So I think the question relates also to Marta's pushback against my comment. And I appreciate also that you kind of tried meet me halfway. But unfortunately, I think from a strategic point of view, even though the security and democracy is in its own silos in terms of experts, at the end, the resources, political resources, especially time and attention of leaders, is a finite and unidimensional resource. So Joe Biden could either spend more time on dealing with Ukraine or more time plotting how to effectively, put the end to this MAGA anti-democratic movement. And how to, in my view, rebalance from genuine security threats to, in my view, underestimated threats, internal threats to democracy. My personal experience from here, from Poland, over 8 years of peace rule, is that the main problem why we underestimate the internal threat is that most of you don't really believe that what the new right is bringing is true authoritarianism. Your question kind of suggested, you mentioned civil liberties, which is important, but I am talking about democracy in much more basic sense. I'm talking about how many of you think that if Donald Trump wins, there is at least 25% of a chance that 2024 is the last free and fair election in our lifetime in America. I do, yes? How many of you would think that if Kaczynski comes back to power the third time with all the lessons he learned from the past and not much of a life expectancy and thereby threat of accountability ahead of him, we may see the last free and fair election in Poland, yes? I think that's, from my personal experience, talking about those issues with people who are, democratic decision makers, I think that's the main thing. We talk at the rallies, in speeches about the threat to democracy, but deep down, we don't viscerally believe that that democracy can really be shut down. So my advice to make a more reasonable strategy, answer your question, to rebalance, is believe the far right. They really want to shut down the show.
But what do we do to stop that? But
I mean, I can talk about it. I co-wrote a book about it, but I don't want to occupy.
No, let's answer that question, because I think it's extremely important, because I don't want this panel to just be about laying out the problems. I want it to be about problem solving as well. So if you could, Maciej, in like 2 minutes, just explain to us what we can do. And then Arun, I definitely want to bring you in, because Trump was mentioned and you have to speak up.
So there are two options. One is hardball. We destroy the far-right political movement. We put people to jail. The other one is compromise. So round table in Poland was a good. My view is that we need a combination of both, partly because I deeply believe that the new right is Darwinian, deeply Darwinian in their mindset, so they will not come to the table unless they are threatened with jail, significant jail time. If you think about US history, that's how Abraham Lincoln dealt with conservatives of that time, racist conservatives of that time, in order to even bring, it failed after 2 decades, but even bring some progress on democratic issues, he needed to fight a bloody war. And I hope we don't need a civil war, but I think we need a mix of strong accountability. So Trump should have been in jail already. And then there would be a better chance, in my view, to make a deal with, Nikki Haley Republicans on certain institutional arrangements. And if we had the same thing, if we could have the same thing here in Poland, which is people who really cross the line are in jail, then we can sit down with moderate conservatives and think like, what are the rules of the game that you are willing to tolerate? So a mix of hardball and reconciliation.
I mean, I will say the thing that breaks my heart is on stage right now with Kamala Harris. Not right now, it's early there, but later today will not be Nikki Haley, but will be Liz Cheney. And in this way, you know, we are rehabilitating actual monsters and then pretending they're not monsters because we have a new monster. And I think this isn't totally a winning move. But in every country, you know, that I work in the U.S., other places, anywhere, I'm not here to tell you, you know, that polarization is not my only tool. It is. That's how every digital thing works. It's how politics works, you know? Like I would say grow up to all of you are going to say anything different. But, grow up. But, evil's awesome. So like we can't do this like good versus evil polarization, right? I just saw a meme that had Donald Trump as Darth Vader with Stormtrooper, and I was like, you wouldn't vote for that guy. That's Darth Vader, right? If he was running in any country, he would win. And so I do think, and this is some of the stuff that actually, quite honestly, was pioneered here in Poland with rise of Confederacy and stuff, but instead of the good and evil polarizing on normal and weird. And I think you do see in the U.S. Some of this being adopted, some of the stuff that we pioneered in Europe actually being adopted by the Harris campaign. You don't want to just call people weird. This is, you know, like any autocrat, because it's like calling someone ugly or stupid. But it's that they have strange priorities. They're into weird stuff. And why this is such a sticky argument anywhere against autocrats is because even if I want you desperately to deport the immigrants, you keep talking about gender essentialism and where kids go to the bathroom, and I don't know even what that is. You're into weird stuff, you know, like, and you're into weird stuff, and you're not focused on just cutting my taxes, which is what I'm paying you for, right? Like Donald Trump's being elected to cut taxes, not to talk about Hannibal Lecter. So this kind of weird versus strange obsessions narrative does work. And the other thing that's very important, and again, learned it here, actually not in the US, so we're trying to apply it now in the US, is you can't just serve up the horrible things these guys say and expect people to understand what it is. Confederacia's opening event was Salvador Menson saying the 5 things we're against in our program are Jews, homosexuals, taxes, abortion, and the EU. Right? It was very memorable. I can still just whip them off like that. And if you look at the comment section when we were like, oh, we've got them, you know, everyone in Poland will see this and they're immediately going to not vote for these guys. People were like, oh, what's the tax plan? You're like, you heard the part about the Jews and the homosexuals, right? And it's like, yeah, but they always do that. A much more effective ad was a political quiz saying, you know, do you know what Confederacia thinks of Yoda? They think he's a Jew. But then showing regular people over Poland reacting. We need to surface these things these guys say and do, and then also show a jury of our peers reacting so that people know how to react in this kind of new weird versus normal polarization. I do think that's the most effective tools we have. It does seem to be effective, but implementing it is hard. But thanks for the question.
Christal, I want to bring you in because you're also looking at these narratives. What do you think is the solution?
Well, I think we got a little bit far away from the original question that started it all off, so maybe I just loop it all back in. So when we talk about democracy versus autocracies, there's actually a scale. There's an institute called the Varieties of Democracy Institute, and they look at how countries every year are changing, how their elections are going, what is their media, how independent is their judiciary. So we can have an idea of where our country and other countries are on this scale and where the world sits. And right now where the world sits is almost equal in terms of the number of countries. There are around 91 democracies and there are around 88 autocracies around the world. So when we think about how we react in this environment, it's an environment in which autocracies have been growing. And also there isn't just democracy and autocracy. There are 2 different kinds of democracies. There are the liberal democracies and there are electoral democracies where some of the freedoms have been restricted, like freedom of media or the judiciary isn't as independent, right? And then there are also electoral autocracies. India is an electoral autocracy. We sometimes call these countries democracies because they have elections. Russia also has elections, right? So there are a lot of very confusing factors about what is the quality of freedom within a governing body, within a state. And the thing about democracy or liberal democracy that is good is that that's where you have the most freedom as an individual. And that's why I think many people still like the idea of democracy, although we can see that autocracies are getting more sexy, so to speak, because democracies solve problems slowly. And this is something that's becoming a problem, especially for younger generations, because the climate crisis, jobs, everything, it's like we want them now, not 20 years from now. And when we have polarized societies are unstable, unsustainable democracies. That's what a grown-up says. And what I think is more important about a sustainable democracy is citizens that get along. So the more that we hate on each other, the more that we polarize, and the more that we really stimulate this anger, it destabilizes countries and nations. It puts families apart. It puts neighbors against each other. And so what I started saying at the beginning is how we talk about the future is going to bend the future in one direction or the other. The larger that conversation gets about finding something that Poles want to do together, and that is a happy vision of the future, a vision of the future we want to live in, the more we can unite around those things, the more stable and predictable our democracies will be.
We do have time for one last short question, if anybody, the gentleman over here.
Yes, hello. I can partly agree with Ms. Christal, and I want to ask you about how can you define democracy? For example, as you mentioned about you want to see Donald Trump in jail, is it a democratic way of thinking? Because maybe not. And my question is more global. How can you convince the global South to be democratic, more democratic, or cooperate with us, not with the BRICS countries? Because in my opinion, this is the main problem and the main question, because people from there, let's say, from the South, global South, don't think as we do. Or you mentioned about the bubbles of information that we live in. And I think they live in the other world than we are. Thank you.
Who would like to take that on? Defining democracies.
Maybe a short answer. How can we convince the global South to democracy? Well, I don't know, frankly speaking, but I'm certain it's much more difficult than it was even 10, 20, or 30 years ago. Because the authoritarian states like China have much more financial resources. They are much more attractive in some way to not fully democratic states in the South. They offer much more than it was previously. Previously, it was the West who had monopoly, let's say, on capital, monopoly on technology, controlling the sea lanes. And now we have lost that to a large extent. So democracy is getting less and less attractive. It does not go in line with progress, with economic development as it was in the past. Additionally, of course, we have all these challenges of digital media, of social media, which put additional burden on promotion democracy. It is much more easier to spread all kind of lies, of other things by especially non-state actors and non-state actors which are fueled by, let's say, geopolitics. Therefore, well, I think the answer is not easy, but I think promoting democracy is much more challenging than in the past, unfortunately.
Apart from the tradition, very respective tradition of research on democracies that Christal mentioned, there is another one which is much closer to my work, which defines democracy, and that answers your question directly, as the system where ruling parties can lose elections. Yes, and I think this is much more compelling to me than these varieties of democracies. And from that point of view, putting to jail a person who wants to shut down the system of free and fair elections is absolutely democratic, yes? The question is, do you really believe that that's what Trump wants to do or Kaczynski wants to do? And as I admitted, I think very few people, even opposition to those politicians, believe as strongly as I personally do that, yes, that's exactly, they are not about weird policies. They are about shutting down free and fair elections. It's just that they are learning how to do it, and that's why it's a slow process, partly because of their learning, and partly by design, because they want you to believe that they are not about to shut it down. In 2012 in Venezuela, still the vast majority of Venezuelans thought they have a democracy. About half of Russians in mid-2010s believed they had democracy. So from the perspective of a simple definition, free and fair election, it shows you how easy it is to lose this electoral democracy without even noticing.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. A round of applause for the panelists. And thank you to everyone who had questions and took part in this. It's extremely hard to summarize this and put this in a nutshell. It's an extremely broad topic. I think that in the context of Poland, we just and Europe in general, we just have to remember that promoting democracy, I think, is no longer the way forward. We can't even use that terminology. It just doesn't go along with what folks in the Global South want to see, but we can serve as an example, a positive example. Thank you.
Jedzą kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Obrażanie dziennikarzy telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Przygotowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.
Für Deutschland.
TVP Info. Włącz się na nowo.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
Plany biznesowe powstają z marzeń. Dlatego nie ma dwóch takich samych firm. Jedni chcą działać na całym świecie. Innym cały świat mieści się w dłoni. Sukces biznesu to nie tylko jego wielkość, ale też szczęście, jakie przynosi ludziom. PKO Bank Polski.
Uwielbiam szycie w sieci. Wczoraj podszyłem się pod wnuczka, wieczorem uszyłem intrygę na apce randkowej, a dziś planuję grubymi nićmi szyte oszustwo z promocją. Tak się szyje.
Na oszustów są sposoby. Zapoznaj się z poradami ekspertów na niedajsiepodszyć.pl.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihrer Ausreise
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 000 osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.
Zapraszamy do Trójki. Od nowa.
Trójka. Program Trzeci Polskiego Radia.
Czy wytrzymasz klockowe tortury? Ze stoickim spokojem. Czy w twardych negocjacjach zachowasz zimną krew? Czy poddasz się dobrowolnej eksmisji ze swojego łóżka? Brawo! Test na obecność serca zaliczony. To znaczy, że ty też możesz być rodzicem zastępczym. Dowiedz się jak na testserca.pl.